How's it going, everyone? Today we're doing a deep dive into one of my favourite games of the last few years, the one I've been saying on Reddit I want to do a video on for months. That's right, it's The Outer Wilds, the very first subreddit I ever joined. For those of you who don't know, The Outer Wilds is an amazing game, and I will be doing my best to keep this UI analysis as spoiler-free as possible. However, that being said, some examples have to rely on particular places being referenced, so if you would like to go into this game knowing absolutely nothing, then stop the video now, leave a like and a subscribe before you go, and come back once you've played this amazing game. Now today we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm not going to do a holistic review of the entire user interface. I want this one to be a deep dive, and I mean we're going deep. This is a real in-depth breakdown of one particular element of the user interface of Outer Wilds to really understand the design decisions which have been made to arrive to where we are. This is the kind of stuff that if you're a software designer or a UX UI designer, you actually have to spend time doing when you're constructing your features for your product. And the element we're going to pick is this globe. It might not seem like much, but there is so much interesting stuff packed into this little orb, so let's jump into it. First, let's talk about what this orb is not. It is not a topographic map of the planet you're on, similarly to Final Fantasy VIII or something. Even as far as the PS1, we've been able to render a somewhat accurate world map onto a sphere on the interface, which was actually even more complicated in Final Fantasy VIII because that world was actually a torus, not a globe. No, this is just a representation of a sphere, split into 10 latitude and 10 longitude elements. So why was this decision made? Well, Outer Wilds is an exploration game, so you want to present the user with the minimum amount of free information as possible. So this neatly limits you to relative position and orientation of the globe. Now, it's also a solid globe, which is unique compared to the other elements of the UI which allows you to see through them to the world behind them. This is because if the sphere were see-through, you would have to make the decision to either have the back half of the sphere visible at the same time, which would run the risk of creating a rotation optical illusion where it's not clear which way the sphere is rotating, or you only render the front half of the sphere, but if you did that, you wouldn't be able to get this shading in that makes it look spherical at all, and it would just look like a circle, running the risk of the player mistaking it for a mini-map. So the decision to make this UI element specifically solid, even when none of the others are, makes sense. How does this globe help with orientation? Well, you'll notice that the North Pole and South Poles are colour-coded. Now this takes a small amount of outside knowledge to know this, but the North Pole is shaded red, consistently with magnets on Earth that point to magnetic north, and the South Pole is shaded blue, which is common in bar magnets, although not universal. The shading then blends to black at the equator, so there's no harsh change. You could of course blend to white or magenta at the equator between blue and red, but black will give the best feel for a space game, given that at any given time about half your field of view is some kind of shade of black anyway. Now, if you don't know what the colour coding of the poles are, it is also indicated by the pinning of the orientation of the globe. Now check this out. Here is the North Pole, and here is the South Pole. Do you see the difference? The North Pole is always situated above the user and the South Pole is always situated below the user. It means that the user arrow, a simple unambiguous yellow arrow, is always heading upward to north up the screen and downward to south. Very subtle, very cool. Now this does lead to a bit of jankiness around the pole specifically, because to keep the North Pole above you in this orientation, you need to rotate the globe rather than flip it as you pass close to the pole. This can lead to a bit of disorientation as the globe corrects itself, but it's definitely an edge case. All this though means that when you're pointed towards a particular pole by a clue, you know when landing which pole you're currently at and which direction you're pointing. And this is almost enough to be able to navigate on its own. It means that when you come to puzzles like finding Rybeck on Brittle Hollow, this clue is enough information for you to be able to simply walk north and find the village he's referring to. I mean, you could also stumble upon it of course, but most players will go to Apple Rock Ruins Observatory Village. Now let's talk about the final piece of the puzzle, the path you've already been. As you wander about, you leave a breadcrumb trail on this map. totally invaluable if you're exploring in a methodical way. Now, humans are not used to navigating a highly curvilinear geometry. In real life, mostly, if you walk 1 mile south and 1 mile east, you'll need to walk 1 mile north and 1 mile west in order to get back to where you were. The planets in Outer Wilds are small enough that they are noticeably curved when navigating, and this means that accidentally doubling back on yourself, or worse, getting hopelessly lost, are common occurrences. By having this breadcrumb trail on the map, you are significantly helping the user to navigate in this space. Now let's talk about what I think is the coolest thing about this breadcrumb trail. It scales with the size of the planet you're currently on. Okay, so here's the experiment I did. First, I went to the poles of Ember and Brittle Hollow and planted my scout on one pole. Then I took my ship to the other pole so that I could measure the diameter of both planets. Now, walking from one pole to the other as best I could, avoiding hazardous terrain, I'm then seeing how many times I can double back on myself before the breadcrumb trail starts disappearing. The answer is the same on both planets. It's 1.5 circumferences of that planet. Now, why is this a good thing? Okay, let's consider the two edge cases. No breadcrumb trail at all, yeah, that obviously wouldn't be great, and an infinite breadcrumb trail, just constantly being added to, overlapping on itself and making a mess on our nice orb here. Hopefully we can agree that the two extremes are undesirable, and so therefore we do want disappearance of the breadcrumb trail after a certain distance. But why does it have to be distance? Could it be time? Well, yes, and there are pros and cons to that, but Outer Wilds is not a rushy game. It's a calm, contemplative, and steady-paced game. A game where, spoiler warning, there are literally no enemies except the environment around you, and so you're not really incentivized to rush about because that actually increases the probability that you're going to meet an unfortunate fate. So we say that it wants to be distance-based, and we want a finite length to it, so what should that length be? Well, let's say 1.5 Ember twin circumferences is adequate. What would that look like on Brittle Hollow? Well, Ember twin has a diameter of about 340 meters, just over half of Brittle Hollow. That would mean that roughly the 1.5 circumferences on Ember twin would translate to about 0.75 circumferences on Brittle Hollow. Now that sounds like it might be sufficient until you start drawing it out on a sphere. Doubling a sphere's diameter makes the surface area multiply by 4, so if I travel from the pole to the equator, do 1/4 of the way round the equator and then make it back towards the pole, my line will start disappearing when I get back to where I started. By scaling the length of the breadcrumb trail by the size of the planet you're on, you ensure that the same percentage of the planet can be mapped out in the same length of trail. So with all this said, what are we left with? Well, we're left with a super competently designed piece of UI, clearly marking your location and the relative location of your ship, sensibly shaded and pinned to avoid you becoming disoriented as it moves around, and with a breadcrumb trail which scales sensibly with the size of the area you're exploring. These are the kind of subtle decisions which separate good designers from great designers. And I take my hat off to the person or team at Mobius Digital that designed this component. With that, it just remains for me to say thank you very much for watching this video. As I'm recording this, we are really close to 100 subscribers, which is just amazing. Thank you very much for all of your support. It would be great for you to like this video. If you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing. And as always, we'll chat soon.